convene the afternoon session of the Tuesday, January 23rd Board of County Commissioners meeting. Good afternoon, everyone, and anyone watching online. We are starting today afternoon with two public hearings. Excuse me just a minute, get my script in order. First one is on ordinance number 24-01. No, it's not. Yes, it is. 24-01 in the matter of amending Lane Code 16.244, Section 5B4 and 10.271, Section 5B4 to define the term footprint as used in regards to the replacement, repair, alteration, or modification of a structure in the floodway and adopting a savings and severability clause. File number 509 PA 23-05424. This is a public hearing on a county-initiated Type 4 legislative land use application to amend the county's code. Today's date is January 23rd, 2024. The proposed Lane Code amendments are subject to the applicable criteria identified in Lane Code 12.100.005, 12.100.050, and 16.252, and applicable Lane County Rural Comprehensive Plan goals. The order of proceedings for this hearing will be first the report by staff, followed by public testimony, and then additional comments by staff. The board's decision may be appealed to the Land Use Board of Appeals in accordance with ORS Chapter 197. At this time, I will call for disclosure of any commissioners' abstentions due to conflicts of interest or biases. Commissioner Farr?
I do not, thank you.
Commissioner Senega?
None.
Commissioner Buck?
None.
Vice Chair Lovell?
None.
And I, Chair Trieger, have none. Next, I will call for any challenges to the board's qualifications to hear this matter from anyone in the room. Diana, is there anyone online who wishes to challenge the board's qualifications to hear the matter?
One moment, Chair Farr, let me ask. If you have any reason to challenge this matter, please raise your hand now and I will call upon you. No hands are raised, Chair Farr, or Chair Trieger, I apologize.
Thank you. So we will now hear a report from staff. And we have with us Rachel Searslove. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair Trieger. And good afternoon, Commissioners. For the record, this is Rachel Searslove, Staff Planner for the Floodway Code Amendment Project. And the item before you today is a public hearing on amendments to Lane Code to clarify code language for floodway development and make the code more permissible when replacing or altering structures in the floodway. And I do have a presentation for you. So I just want to start out with some project history. The Land Management Division is undergoing a code modernization project to comprehensively update Lane Code Chapter 16, and as part of that project in 2020 and 2021, staff worked to update the Floodplain Development Code, which is Chapter 16, 244, and 10.271. In those years, Ordinance 2008 was the ordinance that was adopted with major revisions to the Floodplain Development Code, and Ordinance 2107 was initiated subsequently to address minor fixes in that new code. At the very end of Ordinance 2107 hearing process, the board at the time made an assignment that staff should more clearly define the term footprint and as used specifically applying to floodway development. During the hearing process for Ordinance 2107, there was also public comment that raised issues with the requirements that limits replacing existing structures in the floodway within the same footprint. So based on that board assignment and that public comment, staff initiated a code amendment process. And in May of 2022, staff met with the Planning Commission for a work session on this topic, and in August held a public hearing. After hearing public testimony, the Planning Commission deliberated in September of last year and provided a recommendation to the board on these amendments, and I'll discuss that recommendation in detail just a little later. So I first want to give a little bit of background on the current requirements for floodway development, just to give some context to these amendments. The regulations surrounding floodway development stem from the National Flood Insurance Program, or the NFIP, and Lane County is a participating community in the program, and in order to participate in the NFIP, the county has to adopt certain floodplain development standards into Lane Code. As a benefit of adopting those specific standards, the residents in Lane County receive a discount on their flood insurance premiums. The minimum NFIP standard for developing in the floodway is that development may only be allowed if the applicant provides a hydraulic or hydrologic analysis conducted by an engineer, certifying that there will be no rise in flood levels that result from that development. For short, we call this a no-rise analysis, and it's reviewed through a Type 2 land use application. And during the adoption of Ordinance 2008 and 2107, the board elected to adopt higher regulatory standards to restrict the uses that could be allowed in the floodway at all. The board chose to prohibit all uses from the floodway except for a handful of uses that they deemed necessary to be located in the floodway. One of these allowed uses is for the replacement, repair, or alteration of structures that already exist in the floodway. And for replacement or modification of those structures is limited to the same footprint, as well as additional criteria. So the draft code that went before the Planning Commission contained three main changes for the floodway code. The proposed code defined the term footprint as directed by the board. It also allowed a 50% expansion in the size of the structure being replaced, and also allowed the reconfiguration or reorientation of the structure. The impetus for the proposal, as I mentioned before, was the board direction regarding footprint, and then also there was some discussion at the board about a possible expansion for existing structures in the floodway. The 50% expansion was also a product of public comment about the inability to replace older manufactured dwellings that were supposedly smaller than manufactured homes available on the market today. And specifically, this public comment came from a specific subdivision that's off of CV Loop Road. And I'll talk a little bit more about those comments later. And then lastly, allowing for reconfiguration or reorientation of a structure when replaced to give property owners more flexibility in where that footprint actually is. So now speaking to the Planning Commission motion and recommendation on the code amendments, the Planning Commission discussed extensively the various policy decisions related to these amendments, and they ultimately motioned to recommend approval of the amendments with three main revisions. They motioned to recommend removal of the proposed 50% footprint expansion, to keep the allowance for reconfiguration or reorientation of the footprint, and to allow for a 5-year replacement window for structures previously removed from the floodway. The Planning Commission deliberated thoroughly on the 50% footprint expansion allowance and ultimately decided not to support inclusion of that allowance because of evidence that most manufactured homes in the CV Loop subdivision could be replaced with new manufactured homes. To determine this, staff analyzed or did an inventory of manufactured homes that are available for purchase currently and compared them to the sizes of existing manufactured homes in the CV Loop area. And based on that information, determined that most manufactured homes in that area could actually be replaced with manufactured homes in the market right now. And so based on this information, the Planning Commission motioned not to support the inclusion of the 50% footprint expansion. But while they did not support the expanded footprint, they did support a reorientation or a reconfiguration of that footprint. We note that there is a difference in sizes of manufactured homes. They come in set sizes, and so the Planning Commission did take consideration of that, and that it may be impossible to find a manufactured home that fits within that exact same dimensions of your current manufactured home. And then lastly, the Planning Commission motioned to add a new allowance to the floodway code for replacement of a structure that was previously removed from the floodway. The current floodway code requires that a structure needs to be existing, or there's an exception for a structure destroyed by the Holiday Farm fire, but it needs to be existing in order to be replaced in the floodway. And this creates some issues for property owners who may have removed their structure from their property without previous approval to remove it or replace it. The Planning Commission heard testimony from property owners in that situation and motioned that staff add this sort of look-back period of 5 years to allow those people who inadvertently removed their structure to have an opportunity to replace them. So that was also added to the draft code that's before you. So as I mentioned, I want to talk a bit about the public comment. There was a significant amount of public comment submitted before the Planning Commission, and most of that public comment was surrounding the 50% expansion. Testimony in support of that 50% increase spoke mainly to difficulties replacing manufactured homes in the same footprint, and many of those comments came from residents of the CV Loop subdivision. And then comments not in support of allowing 50% increase discussed issues of public safety, ecological impacts, water quality issues, and the possibility of worsened flooding as byproducts of allowing a 50% expansion. Comments from both sides of the issue seem to be in support of allowing a reconfiguration or reorientation within the same footprint. While not as many comments have yet been received for this public hearing, I have received similar comments to what was received at the Planning Commission stage, and that was forwarded to all of you. And so moving into action today, there are 3 options that the board can take today. Staff is recommending option 1, which is to approve the ordinance as presented. And the other options are to close the hearing and the record and continue deliberations to a date certain. This option would be chosen if the board does not want to see any changes to the proposed code and has enough information to make a decision on the ordinance. The third option is to continue the hearing to a date and time certain. This option is for if the board does not have enough information to make a decision on adopting the ordinance or wants to motion a change in the proposed code. And I have tentatively reserved February 6th and 27th for the second and third option if that's desired by the board. And that concludes my staff report. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. Next in the proceeding is a hearing of public testimony, and we had just 2 people signed up in Harris Hall, and last I heard we had 4 online. Diana, can you give me an update on if we have any more than that, and then I'll see if there's anyone who came in late here that wants to provide testimony to help think about amount of time to provide?
Yes, one moment. I still have 4 that are signed up. I'm not sure they all want to give testimony. If you are signed up to give testimony on this item, please raise your virtual hand. I see 4 hands went up.
4, and I see 1 more person in Harris Hall, so who wants to give testimony. So I think we can do 3 minutes per person without it getting too time challenged for us. So I will start with the folks who signed up here in Harris Hall. It will be Lori Wellborn first, followed by Grace Whitacombe. I'll ask that you come to the podium, state your name for the record, and when you do, the timer on the wall will start. Then we will move over to the online comments and then come back to Harris Hall for anyone that didn't get a chance to sign in. So Lori Wellborn first, please. Thank you and welcome.
There are a lot of people living out there, and a lot of the buildings are very small and they are very old. And as far as expanding the footprint with a new dwelling that might be a little bit bigger, it is hard to find dwellings that fit everyone's needs. One of the issues brought up was the ecological impact. The present structures that are there, that were put in when this first started up out there, are not safe. They have lead in the paint. There is asbestos in the floors and in the walls in many of them. And basically, if that goes down the river, that's not going to be ideal either. The present building materials are a little bit better. And that's something to take into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you just please state your name for the record, just so we have that on?
Lori Wellborn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Grace Whitcomb. I give the call just a, there we go. Okay.
My name is Grace Whitcomb, and to let you know a little bit about my background, I run a house flipping business. I have flipped a house in CV Loop. Hello? Anyways, flip houses. Hopefully you've driven the CV Loop area. My motto is making neighborhoods great again. That neighborhood is not great. It is in poor shape in many of those lots. A single wide, that are many of those are single wide mobile homes. They're not even called manufactured homes. HUD or FHA will call them mobile homes. They are not lendable, so you have to replace them with a new, much bigger house. I don't even get the 50% thing. It would be 100% bigger if you put a double wide where a single wide is now. Again, single wides since 1977 have not been lendable. That means you can't get a mortgage for them. It's hard to get a mortgage for a manufactured home anyway, but those single wides need to be replaced. They need to have bigger footprints, and unless you're going to put a tiny home out there. And I mean, really, are we going to try to save this neighborhood or just let it go to the abyss? Because that's what's going to happen if we don't allow a larger footprint. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. I'll turn it over to Diana to manage the online queue.
Thank you, Chair Trieger. At this time, if you raise your virtual hand and leave your hand up, I will call on you in the order that the hands have been raised. When I call on you, I will ask you if you would like to be on camera, and if you would like to be, I'll convert you to camera as well. Our first speaker will be Lori Siegel, followed by James Babson. Sorry, the font is, James Babson. Lori, I will unmute your microphone, and would you like to be on camera?
No, thank you.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Lori Siegel. I'm speaking on behalf of Landmarch Lane County today. We participated in the Planning Commission public hearing process. We're in support of the decision that the Planning Commission made on the footprint. However, the issue of the 3-year look back came up at the very last minute at the Planning Commission in a motion from one of the commissioners. It was passed, but it was never an issue before people participating in the public hearing. I'm not complaining about the fact that no one had an opportunity to comment on that at that point, because we have that opportunity today. However, after our attorney reviewed the language of the proposal, he submitted a letter today, earlier this afternoon, regarding the inconsistency of this amendment with House Bill 2192 that went into effect this year. So the proposed amendments are inconsistent with House Bill 2192 and the maximum look-back period of 3 years allowed by that bill for replacement of dwellings in the farm and forest zones. The inconsistency that I'm speaking about has to do with the fact that Lane Code 16244, which is being amended by this ordinance, allows a 5-year look back but doesn't distinguish between zones. Therefore, it appears to apply in all zones, and it would allow a 5-year look back period. Look back refers to replacement of dwellings that no longer exist. The motion that was made by the Planning Commission was to allow dwellings that no longer existed 5 years prior to the date this ordinance is adopted to be replaced. Again, that's inconsistent with House Bill 2192 for the reasons that I've already mentioned. And I'll go ahead and leave it at that today. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. Our next speaker is James Babson, followed by Robert Emmons. James, I will unmute your microphone, and please let me know if you'd like to be on camera. And
no,
would you like to be on camera? Okay.
No, thanks.
You may begin your public comment.
Okay, I do support the county's wording in this ordinance that does not increase the footprint of a replacement structure. We are trying to get away from development in the floodway, not increase it. The current code contains a strict, quote, regulatory standard for floodway development, given the risk that this highly hazardous flood zone poses to life and property, end quote. So more development in the floodway will result in more risk to life and property and potentially more liability for the county in the possibility of a catastrophic flood. I would add to that definition of risk is the risk to the environment. Modern buildings, as someone already alluded to, are made out of and filled with a wide variety of toxic materials, all of which will be floating downstream in the event of a major flood. So more bigger buildings, more pollution downstream in the event of a flood. Another problem with increasing the footprint of structures in the floodway is that that wording would apply to all floodways in the county. So you've heard a lot from the CV Loop Road neighbors, but large homes, and they're all small homes, but large homes anywhere in the floodway in Lane County would also be allowed to be replaced with even larger homes. And please remember, it's not just homes we're talking about here, it's structures, barns, sheds, anything could have an increased footprint if you change that language about maintaining the same size footprint. So again, just to reiterate, let's get away from development in the floodplain. Let's increase it. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Robert Emmons. Robert, I will unmute your microphone, and if you would let me know if you'd like to be on camera, I'll move you over. Robert, it looks like you need to unmute your microphone.
Can I be heard now?
Yes.
Okay.
Would you like to be on camera?
No, I don't need to be on camera. Thank you. Yeah, Robert.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Can you start your public comment? Yes.
Okay. So I'm Robert Emmons, 40093 Little Fall Creek Road in Fall Creek. These comments will be on my own behalf, but also on behalf of Landwatch Lane County. It's certainly doubtless that during flood events, the floodway becomes a high hazard area, or anything in it, including toxic construction materials that have already been alluded to, can be inundated, dislodged, and sent downstream at high and dangerous velocities. Therefore, there should be nothing in the floodway except the vegetation that's native to it. However, for those houses in the floodway that may have preceded floodplain regulation and were mistakenly permitted on some occasions, Landwatch supports the county's proposal to disallow expansion of the footprint of an existing dwelling, but permit the reconfiguration, just as was explained by Ms. Zerslev earlier, of the existing square footage to accommodate a replacement dwelling. So let's free up as best we can and keep it from being a dangerous area, the floodway part of our floodplain, and certainly respect the needs of people who have houses already built there, but I think the county has found and other research has shown that there are copious opportunities to find replacement dwellings that will fit within the same footprint. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. At this time, oh, there we go. Tom Bowerman, I will unmute your microphone and you may begin your public comment. Please let me know if you would like to be on camera. Tom, I show that you are self-muted. There you go. Would you like to be on camera?
Yes, go ahead.
Right, one moment.
Do I have to do something else? Join as a panelist?
Yes, please accept the join as a panelist and then unmute your camera. It appears we have lost Mr. Bowerman. I'm going to see if he'd like to rejoin. Chair Trigger, would you like to see if there's other, oh, maybe he came back. There he is. Tom, we can see you, but not your camera. Can you unmute your camera and then we'll be able to see you? There you go.
Hello, Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I appreciate the work that you do. I'm here to endorse the Planning Commission's recommendation to you. I did attend the early Planning Commission hearings on this. The first time I went, I was just going as an observer, and I was quite surprised by the multitude of testimony from Mobile Life Estates, the manufactured house community there. So I was interested in what they had to say. I went out and spent a couple of hours walking the streets and observing the situation out there. I did submit the testimony that I wrote after having made that visit, with the observation that using Lane County flood maps, this particular cluster of communities is right in the floodway of one of the swales of the Willamette watershed. And I could observe that the cluster of houses that were built in that swale occupy the swale at least above 50% of blockage. And the knowledge that when the water does flow through there, it can take them and float them downstream. And when that happens, of course, it's been mentioned with the possibility of debris flowing down the river. But one starts up at the top and it picks up others as it goes down. It could be quite a catastrophe in that. It's almost that you couldn't have picked a better example of where not to build. And I want to also speak, my background is in, I have a degree in architecture. My background is in construction and building, which I've done the latter half of my life. And I have some experience with anchorage and with risks and with building in hazardous areas. And I would say that also that the cost that's been brought up by people, I work in homeless housing quite a bit. And what we lack most is the smaller dwellings. The average houses now in the United States are 2,500 square feet. And what we really lack are buildings that are below or in the area of 1,000 square feet, which these current residences already provide, knowing that they're at the age that they need to be replaced. It would be good to replace with the same size for the sake of maintaining affordable housing, and also certainly not to increase the dam effect that these dwellings have in the floodway. So the floodways, as you well know, are high hazard areas where water flows when it's flooding, and that's what they should be reserved for. And the testimony that's preceded me, I agree with everything that's been said, and I agree with the Planning Commission's recommendation. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this issue.
Thank you for your public comment. Chair Trigger, I do not have anyone else online for speaking, so I'll return the meeting to you.
Thank you. I'll now ask if there's anyone in Harris Hall who didn't get a chance to sign up to speak. Why don't you come step to the podium and please give us your name for the record. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sherilyn Borkern, and I'm here to advocate for the people at Mobile Life Estates in that we are asking for a flexible footprint, which seems to be agreeable with everybody. We're also asking for the liberty to build as we wish, which will be dictated by the size of our lots, which are not very big. So nobody's going to be building mansions. But for example, myself, if I'm going to invest in tearing down the manufactured home I'm in now and putting in a new one, I'm not going to put in the same size. I want probably 300 square more feet because I have personal things that I want to do in my home. So I think that the size of our lots dictate the size of what we can have. And rather than the government dictating that to us, I am asking for the liberty that we carry that torch of justice to have that right of independence for ourselves. And having new homes will ensure that we have tie downs if it is replaced with a mobile or a stick home. And the problem of asbestos and the chemicals are not in new homes, as somebody formerly mentioned. They are in the old homes that we live in now. If these homes were to fall apart by flood or fire or earthquake, which I believe fire is much more likely to happen than a flood. I mean, this is a 100-year flood zone. It has flooded once in 100 years. And the flood was a couple feet. So, and it didn't come from the river, it came from the drains. So that should be looked at as well. But I'm just saying that newer homes are safer homes. They're HUD approved. They don't have asbestos. They don't have lead. If these homes, again, I just want to reiterate, if these homes right now fell apart from any natural disaster, the asbestos, the formaldehyde is going to be in the air. It's going to be in the waters for undetermined amount of times. And when people can't build onto their homes, they start buying RVs and placing them in streets, and that becomes the extra space. If a flood comes, an RV, believe me, it's not going to stay put where it is. It's going to float down somebody else's front room. So I'm just saying there are good reasons for people to improve their homes and to want to live their life in liberty and not be so controlled by the government that we can't expand how we want to within our lot limits. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. Is there anyone else in Harris Hall wishing to speak to this item? Seeing none. Are there any additional comments by staff?
Thank you, Chair Trieger. I do have some responses that I'd like to give. The first is to Lori Siegel's comment regarding this 5-year look-back period. And I received the testimony from Sean Malone, Landwatch Lane County's attorney, just before this hearing. So I have not had time to vet the issue with legal counsel or with anyone else. But my feelings is that there's no issue with the look-back period that's in the farm and forest zones for replacement dwellings, which is a 3-year look-back period. That's what Ms. Siegel was referencing with House Bill 2192, I believe it is. That's the allowances of the base zone, which is the F2 or the farm or forest zone. What's allowed in the base zone has to be met first. And then the floodplain zone is an overlay zone. And those are additional restrictions or requirements for building on that lot. So in order for a development to happen, it first needs to meet those requirements of the base zone. So if we're talking about a replacement dwelling, it would have to meet that 3-year look-back period that Ms. Siegel is referring to, and the 5-year that's being proposed in the floodplain code would in no way trump what the base zone requirements are. So I don't think there's any issue there, but we'd be happy to confer with legal counsel and get back to the commissioners on that. And then I did just want to speak to Ms. Borkin's comments about the desire for larger dwellings. The Planning Commission did have an extensive discussion surrounding this, that staff has done the research looking at available manufactured homes and the fact that there is quite a bit of manufactured home stock that's available for purchase that these folks could replace within the same footprint. And so the Planning Commission did discuss quite extensively that this is a desire for a larger dwelling, and the main question is, should this desire be granted, and also, if it is that worth putting these people into more risk because they are located, or these properties specifically are located in a higher flood hazard area? So I just wanted to highlight that that's something that the Planning Commission did discuss very thoroughly, and they weighed a lot of the different factors that are involved in this issue, because there are many factors. And I think that covers it for my response to public comment. Thank you.
Thank you. So procedurally, I'm looking here at the options to close the hearing or move to continue. I know we have dates available to move to continue. Apologies for looking to Ms. Surslev for that. So I'm looking for a motion from the board for whether we want to close the hearing or continue to the 6th or 27th. Yes? Okay. Vice Chair, do you have a motion?
Chair, I'm prepared for a motion with
Commissioner Farr? Yeah.
with a question for Ms. Surslev. You suggested that you may wish to consult with council regarding the you use the term trumping the base zone.
I'm fairly confident on my answer to that, so I don't know, unless the board has a lot of concern about that issue, we could return. I don't know that it's really a reason to continue the hearing, but I think there may be other reasons to do that.
That's the answer to that. And I have a second question, Chair, and that is regarding if the public hearing were closed at this point and the board, during our discussion, raises concerns that would potentially require a reopening of the public hearing, that we could step back and reopen the public hearing.
I think it would be preferable to, if there are anticipated changes to the draft code, that the public hearing be kept open.
So perhaps a delay in making the motion until the board has had some chance to deliberate, perhaps?
That's amenable to me.
It's not my choice, but yeah, that's fine.
Are there any questions from the board before to help anyone settle on whether they want to advance a motion? Commissioner Seneca?
Go ahead.
What does a no-rise analysis cost, roughly?
I wouldn't know, or I don't know offhand. I would say in the range of maybe thousands of dollars, I would say. You do have to hire a certified professional engineer, so just that alone can incur some cost.
Okay. I was just doing the math on all the requirements versus maybe paying a little more for flood insurance, and, when does that weigh out? I do have some concerns about not implementing the 50% increase in size. I don't know if now's a good time to discuss that or not. Sure.
I guess I'll just clarify what the options are for the board. So if there is a desire to deliberate today and time to deliberate today, that's definitely an option. I have identified February 6th if the board feels confident with the information that they've received thus far. The hearing could be closed and you could continue just deliberations to February 6th. Or if you would like to receive more public testimony on this issue or make further changes to the code, then I would suggest that the hearing be continued to February 27th.
Commissioner Farr?
Thank you, Chair Trigger. And based on that, I'd prefer to hold off because a couple of my questions may induce further public comment. If I may, with a couple of quick questions that I have. The draft ordinance before us includes recommendations, language recommended by the Planning Commission, and not the language that was asked for by the Board of Commissioners. The Board of Commissioners, help me with my memory, did the board ask you to come back with an ordinance that allowed for a 50% increase in the...
No, the board did not provide that direction. It was just a board assignment to define the term footprint, and that definition is still in the draft code that's before you now.
And once again, help my memory, when did the 50% first come up? The 50% addition?
That was the actual number, 50%, was never an option before the board. There was discussion and public testimony at the board that it may be overly restrictive to not allow some sort of increase in footprint, but there was never a set percentage or set number that was proposed at the board during the last ordinance adoption. That 50% was a result of before staff initiated the code amendment project with the Planning Commission, we did research on just building permits that we've reviewed for manufactured dwellings, looking at older existing manufactured dwellings and what size manufactured dwellings they were being replaced with. And this was just an inventory of building permits that had come into our office. It wasn't necessarily a review of manufactured homes that are available on the market.
Chair Trigger, thank you. That helps me have more confidence in my memory that we never actually stated 50%. But we had testimony today that said 50% is not enough, potentially, maybe 100%. That's in testimony. So I have another question. If we were to go with a percentage increase, whether it be 50%, 100%, whatever it may be, does that run afoul of any higher code requirements from the federal government or from state government?
No, it does not. It makes the code more permissible, but our code is currently more restrictive than what's required by the National Flood Insurance Program.
And we'd asked that question before, so we are more restrictive. So even increasing the footprint does not make us less restrictive than
Correct.
The federal floodplain. So if we were to increase the footprint, we're not running afoul. We could do it. It more or less is a policy decision by this Board of County Commissioners, with a recommendation from the Planning Commission that we don't do it, that we'd leave it at the existent. Well, I'm going to wax a little bit here. When we came to the United States, we lived in a single-wide mobile home for a lot of years. And we had, initially, I'm not going to go into how big our family was, but, it's pretty tight quarters. And Mr. Bowerman, I commend him for all of the work that he has done in helping to build Square One villages and some of the other very tiny footprint houses. But for folks who are living in a single-wide mobile home, particularly who have done so for a long time, and even after I moved to Lane County, my wife and I still lived in a single-wide mobile home, and it is really quite restrictive. And one thing that you always think about, if you've lived there for a lot of years, is, I wish this was a bit bigger, and sometimes you have a chance to make it bigger. If you live we lived in a mobile home park in Springfield, and we could have probably not added a larger mobile home, but we could have got a different mobile home. But so I have a little bit of a soft spot for folks who live in a single-wide mobile home, or it's something that's 600 square feet, maybe in some cases smaller, some cases a little bit bigger. It really is restrictive on a person's lifestyle. Now, this board, we talk often about 300 square foot houses, and we long for more 250 square foot houses. But my soft spot is for the people who are currently living or have lived for years in a single-wide mobile home, who would desire to, without changing their address, have a bigger place to live. And if we were to allow that through the policy of this board, then we'd be granting people a different kind of lifestyle in the exact same address that they live in. And we're not running afoul of any floodplain rules. And I would question whether or not we're increasing the residents' vulnerability by allowing them to increase the house. So that's my soft spot on this. I've lived in a single wide. I know what it's like, and I know what it's like when your family increases in size in a single wide, and when you want to entertain guests in a single wide. So, that's where my soft spot lies. I'm going to leave it at that for a moment and let the rest of the board talk.
Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. I come with a particular lens on manufactured housing. I have a deep amount of experience in the mobile home industry, manufactured housing, replacement of really uninhabitable homes in very dangerous areas. Mr. Bowerman did state, and I agree wholeheartedly, that this location on CV Loop was likely the last spot that people could build manufactured housing at the time due to its deep stigma in the community as a housing type, wanting to be outside, a place where most people visually don't see it in a flood way, not just a flood zone, but a floodway, and also made it affordable at the time, and probably more affordable than regular housing even today. I feel like we're at a point where we have to decide between a couple of really bad scenarios in a location of housing that's deeply needed in our community, and likely many homes desperately need to be replaced. And as I did that in a nonprofit, we couldn't even touch any that were in a floodway. There was no way from a legal liability or a lending liability status could we even think about trying to help renovate, update these really hard-hit communities and locations that they likely should have never been built in the first place. Yet you're here, we see you, we know you need help. I imagine we all want to help, but the risk is so high in that location. Of course, it requires reservation and deep thought. This comes on the heels of an announcement today, just today, from Lane County that we have high winds and potential high rain and potential localized flooding next week. And on the heels of an ice storm, where that could be a major event, a major emergency management event. And then the liability comes right back on the county to help people if there was an unfortunate event or flooding. And these homes aren't homes where you can easily take care of a flooding event. Manufactured housing are just built in a different way, and when they're flooded, oftentimes that means it's a scrap and you have to start again. And I wouldn't want you to have FEMA homes. They are not the quality homes that you deserve. So that's where I'm at when I'm kind of deliberating our various options. When I did have the opportunity to redevelop manufactured homes, it wasn't uncommon for us to go to the local municipality and ask for a leeway and variance of the size of the home. It was often 10% or less. That was what we came into most often, and it was enough. And reconfiguration was often needed, and I very much support that. But these were in areas that were not in a floodway of any kind. So the risks were much less, and we were able to replace homes with really good quality manufactured housing. They were safe, which, again, you all deserve. But 50% is, I've never heard of anything close to the 50% in a variance when doing this work. And I want people to kind of look to the longer vision of, should somebody go to the great expense of replacing their home in a floodway, a bigger home, let's say, should we allow that, and a flood occurs, and it has to be scrapped, and what do you do then? And how does the county help manage that in a situation where it could be a large event or a flooding event? That costs way more money in the long term to respond to that kind of large community event. So there has to be a balance of some kind, and that's where I'm looking for information from my colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
Vice Chair Lovell.
Thank you, Chair. Let's look at some of the facts here going on. I understand some of the considerations that we've had about risk and life safety and that sort of thing. And for the life of me, I'm kind of wrapping my head around why would someone spend a lot of money in permitting and going through the county process to get a same-size house. So that's kind of part of the reason, that's why I'm kind of laundering this in my mind. Ms. Whitcomb, you had mentioned that you're a house flipper, and you had mentioned something that was kind of off my radar, but now it's really on my radar about the affordability piece of the puzzle is that you have to be able to finance a house. You have to be able to carry a mortgage. It's not many people that I know of that are walking around with $45,000, $60,000, $80,000 in their pocket that are able to buy a mobile home or a manufactured home and replace their house. And so that alerted me to say, wow, that's an important factor of how these houses, how these neighborhoods can survive in the affordability lane. Can they be financed? And so I think restricting further this neighborhood's ability to finance only creates the problem that we have and makes it worse. These people are not going to be able to afford to replace their houses. They're not going to be able to afford to even make the decisions to do that. And so then some of my questions then start revolving around my developer brain. I keep apologizing for that, and I think I probably shouldn't anymore, is that I think property owners have the building right. And I think Sherilyn Borkman, she brought that up in her public testimony, that building property owners have the building right to build on their property what is rightfully allowed. And so I don't think that a footprint designation, and I think we really did a mission creep on this footprint identification. It was originally brought forth to the board in 2021 in September by then Commissioner Bozovich, who was just trying to get the ambiguity of what a footprint was ironed out. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves into this whole discussion about 50% more building spaces, and if we can build in the floodway, all this other things. And, you know, the fact of the matter is 1996, we had the worst flood we ever had in 100 years. And that neighborhood only had a couple of feet of water, and it wasn't based on river current. It was based on the infrastructure backing up and basically swelling water up into the spaces. So you look at how in the worst event of 100 years, we still didn't have all this fear-mongering that we're putting out there, and that if someone wanted to replace their home, and we allowed them to do so based on what the lot size and zoning allowed them to do, what's to say they couldn't build a stick frame house there? Why would they not want to build a stick frame house there? Why is the discussion always around replacing with manufactured houses? Why are we restricting the choice to these people in this neighborhood, specifically, to a certain kind of housing? I think that's even wrong in itself. So I have a good couple of pages of notes and questions I have about this and some of the means and reasons of how we got here. But I think just for me, people have the right to build on their property what the property allows. And I think that's really where my sticking point is. And I think that if we're going to make this neighborhood viable and continue in this area, obviously we have floodplain and floodway codes that if someone wanted to build a stick house, it has to be at a certain level or a certain height. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that these houses can be, I think, safely built where they're located based on the existing codes that anchor houses to the earth. And to me, all of us see these videos and these news clips of manufactured houses getting whipped away by tornadoes and floods and all that. And to me, that's kind of like the most dangerous kind of animal to put in this particular area of the county. Whereas I think if we were allowing people to build what the property allowed and allowed them to build a stick-built house, which allowed them to get financing and create a house that they really wanted and could reorient it to where hydraulically it wouldn't affect the flow, I think that's what we should do as a county. And that's where I'm at in that support. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think the only thing I want to say is I'm hearing, and I fully respect you. I really appreciate Commissioner Buck bringing it to the folks that are here before us and all of you coming to speak to us. But this is also a county-wide policy, and there are other parts of the county that this will impact. So that is a consideration we have to make and understand too. Were we just making policy for the CV Loop folks might be some different considerations, but also we do want to consider your needs. And while Vice Chair is correct, individuals, once they own a property, should have some agency over how to construct it. It is also our responsibility to ensure that we create policies that don't set people up for failure and put them in danger moving forward. As with for years and years and more recently, we often kick these more complex, in-depth issues to our Planning Commission because they have the time, the expertise, and the staff support to deliberate on them in a way outside of this group. Of course, we do ultimately have the final say, but I also just really want to thank our Planning Commission for all the hours of work that they put into bringing us recommendations that they feel are responsible and sound and good policy. I think we're just at a place now where if there are, as staff offered, we could close the public record if we feel we've gotten enough public testimony, but move forward to another date for further deliberations and ask questions. We could entertain a motion to approve what's before us. We can keep the public record open and move forward with those dates. Those are the options before us. So I will look to this board for a motion to move us forward. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Vice Chair, Chair Trigger, excuse me. And I think I'm prepared to let somebody else make the motion. But first, a quick question regarding some of the comments that the very viable and valid comments that Commissioner Buck mentioned, talking about scrapping a manufactured home if it becomes flood damaged. I understand that. I think that that is the case, quite often because of the construction of a manufactured home or a mobile home for that matter. Once it's flooded, it's very difficult to replace the studding even because it becomes so badly damaged. But I don't know if that makes any difference whether it's 600 square feet or 900 square feet. So it's, I don't think a 600 square foot home is, a 900 square foot home is more dangerous than a 600 square foot home in terms of having to replace it if it gets scrapped for flooding. So I don't think the size of the home makes a difference. And regarding a 50% increase, that isn't that much. And that, if you have a 3,000 square foot house, that's the size of another house. But if you have a 600 square foot house, that's 300 square feet. That brings you up to still less than 1,000 feet. Even if you have a 1,000 square foot house, that brings you up to 1,500 square feet, which is a little less than half of what I think was what one of the testifiers said the average house is in the United States. So, I think adding 50% to these really quite modestly sized homes, and if you have a response, it looks like you might have a response, Rachel, so I'll hold back on that. Doesn't seem like it's adding that much, and I don't know that it adds any greater liability to whether it's scrapped or not scrapped. It has to be replaced completely from scratch or not. So that's a part of my trepidation. And if I make a decision that I don't like what the Planning Commission has suggested regarding no increase in footprint, if I disagree with that and I suggest that we do allow for an increase in footprint, that's going to be my reasoning. So please, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I think there were just a couple things that I wanted to, maybe more information to give to you for this discussion. We did look at the existing manufactured homes and specifically the CV Loop area, and the average was over 1,000 square feet of existing, and there were, again, plenty of manufactured homes that could be obtained that were also 1,000 square feet that were new manufactured homes. So just information on what the actual size of the houses are in that area. And then just, again, to make a clarification that this regulation is applying countywide and not just to specifically this neighborhood. I feel like there was something else I wanted to say. That's it for now. Thank you.
And just a quick follow-up on that. So the regulation is countywide, but then the restriction is also countywide. So, regardless of the size of the home. So if you have a 750 square or a 350 square foot home, with the ordinance the way the Planning Commission has recommended it, you'd still have a 350 square foot home. If you had a 900, it'd still be 900. Whereas if you had a 600, if we did allow an increase, you could have a 900. So whether it's a 1,500 square foot existent house or a 300 square foot existent house, it's still the same regulation, same as countywide. And once again, my soft spot still does exist for people who live in a small home who wish to live in a larger home. I also retain this incredible soft spot for lots and lots and lots and lots more 350 square foot houses in our community. We need lots more of them. So. Once again, that's my decision point. If I decide, Chair, that I'm not in congruence with the Planning Commission's recommendation, it will be because of that. Thank you.
I did realize I had one question I neglected to ask one of our commenters, whether this will apply to any building or dwellings only.
Yes, so the provision is for existing structures in the floodway.
exhausted our questions for staff. Commissioner Buck?
I thought I'd lend myself to a motion to move it forward to the next one, since it seems like we're at a pause and there might be more information that we want to ponder for a little bit. So I was going to move to approve the second reading and public hearing for ordinance number 24-01 and move it forward to a third reading for February 6th at 1:30 time certain. Hopefully that's right date and time.
I would just ask if you amend to the 6th or the 27th, and then that gives us flexibility to work with staff and agenda setting. Mm-hmm.
And Chair, I'm prepared to second. Would that include closing the public hearing or leaving the public hearing open?
I was going to close it because I wasn't hearing a lot more expected, but I'm open if a second would want to change that.
So the motion is to close the public hearing and close the public record and continue the hearing for February 6th or 27th with a 1:30 time certain. That's the motion on the table?
Yes.
And I would like to second that motion, but I would propose a friendly amendment to that, to leave the, and this is for you to consider, to the maker of the motion, to leave the public record open, because it may be that Mr. Malone has further input that he'd like, because he submitted a letter today. Maybe he would like to amend that letter if we kept the public letter hearing open, for instance, or maybe some of the residents would. So if you're okay with I'll second the motion with that recommendation for a friendly amendment.
That's fine. I'll restate it. Moving approval of the second reading and public hearing for ordinance 24-01, leaving the public record open and moving it forward to February 6th or February 27th at 1:30 time certain.
I will second and in queue speak to the motion.
It has been moved by Commissioner Buck, seconded by Commissioner Farr to continue the hearing to a date certain of either February 6th or 27th at 1:30 time certain. Did you want to?
I'm unsure if you need, my intention with providing you two dates was to provide if there need to be amendments to the code that I needed time to make. That's why I provided a more distant further date. But I think if this motion should contain the date that you're proposing to move the continued.
So since we're not asking for any actual changes to the code language, you would be able to be prepared to come back to us as soon as the 6th. Okay, terrific. So then, in that case, the motion can still stand, and then we just know as agenda setting that we'll put it on the 6th of February, and if that's fine. So there's a motion on the table for ordinance 24-01, the Lane Code Floodway Amendments from Land Management Division Department File number 509-PA23-05424 to continue the hearing to a date certain, likely February 6th at 1:30 time certain, but with the 27th on hold if needed. Moved by Commissioner Buck and seconded by Commissioner Farr. And we are not actually voting on the ordinance, so we don't need, yes, Diana?
If I can interrupt for a second, I just want to get clarification when you said the 27th is on hold if needed. Are we rolling it to the 6th, or are we thinking we're having a discussion about rolling it to the 27th?
We're rolling it to the 6th. We're bringing it back to the continuation. Yeah.
And if we move to the 27th, that would not happen until the 6th. Is that correct?
Correct. That's my understanding.
Thank you.
And unlikely because we're not. Yeah. Okay.
Vice Chair, to the motion.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. And so my recommendation may require it to be moved out a little bit, because I would like you to come back with the language that does include a 50% allowance for residences. But I don't have that same soft spot for other non-residential buildings. So is there a way to bring back, would there be a way to bring back an allowance for a 50% increase in a residence, but for no increase in the footprint of an auxiliary or ancillary building?
If that's the direction from the board, then
I'm only one person, but that's what I would like to see.
I would need additional time to make those amendments, so it would probably have to be the 27th.
Once again, I'm only one person, so you all speak to that, and if two other people agree with me on that, then that's all.
So the motion on the table is is for the 6th, which is not to make any code language amendments. So I would suggest, but I'm open to Diana, if this is cleaner for the record, we could, the maker of the motion could withdraw the motion, and then Commissioner Farr could make that request, and if there's head nods, we try again with a later date, or we can take the vote on the motion on the table, which puts us at the 6th with no suggested code amendment language, and then move after that vote as need be.
If I may speak as
Yes,
the chair of the motion,
please.
my intention was to move it forward to have more time that we could actually deliberate and come up with any future changes, given that we have more things on our schedule today. I think if we were to launch into a discussion about actual changes, we would extend our time today. So I personally would like to vote on the motion that I prepared.
I would concur. As a second of the motion, I'll concur with that.
Thank you. Then I will call for the vote with the understanding that on the 6th we may have more conversation about future code language amendment, but we'll find that out on the 6th. So because we're not actually calling for a passage of the ordinance, it does not need to be a roll call vote. We just need a yay or nay on the motion on the table to move to continue the hearing to February 6th, 1:30 time certain. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries 5-0. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that, Commissioner Buck, for helping navigate that. As the room clears, we do have another public hearing. I don't have anyone signed up to speak, but if anyone has come into the room since we started who does wish to speak to Ordinance 23-09, amending lane code around our employee classifications, I don't believe there is. Great. And so, with that, I will welcome to the table our Director of Human Resources, Alana Holmes, and Eliza Kaczynski, our Senior Classification and Compensation Analyst. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chair, Commissioners. We are here today for a second reading as the agenda item is titled, and the public hearing in the matter of amending Lane Code, Chapter 2. I know there's a script to this, and Eliza has taken the lead, so I want to turn it over to her, and you all can go through the process.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for that. This is the time set for a second reading and public hearing on Ordinance 23-09 in the matter of amending Lane Code Chapter 2 to create consistency with the lane manual and current practices as relates to the Assistant County Administrator classification and the delegation of authority to the Fair Board to adopt a separate personnel administration system. The first reading for this ordinance was held on December 5th, 2023. And now I will hand it over to staff for the summary of the item prior to the public hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Trieger and Commissioners. The item before you today is the second reading and potential adoption of Ordinance 2309. Ordinance 2309 will modify sections 2.010.005, 2.020.005, and 2.020.010 of the Lane Code in order to remove out-of-date language within the code to create consistency with the lane manual and current practices. The proposed changes are cleanup items and do not make changes to any current practices or policies. The board is being asked to remove the Assistant County Administrator classification from the list of classifications in Section 2.010.005, where the Board of Commissioners directly provides performance evaluations. The Assistant County Administrator classification was originally created in 2007 during a transition in the County Administrator position and reported directly to the Board of Commissioners at that time. However, the classification has not been in use between 2008 and 2023. The Board adopted updates to the lane manual in 2017 and 2018, which specified that future positions in that classification would report directly to the County Administrator as opposed to the Board of Commissioners. Removing language that specifies that the board completes performance evaluations for the Assistant County Administrator is consistent with the intent of those lane manual amendments, since it would be unusual for the board to conduct performance evaluations for an employee that does not directly report to them. The second change that is being requested to sections 2.020.005 and 2.020.010 removes language that delegates authority to the Lane County Fair Board to adopt a separate system of personnel administration for employees at the Lane County Fairgrounds, including a separate classification plan, compensation plan, and personnel rules. The board initially delegated this authority to the Fair Board in 1998 and reserved the right to revoke that delegation at any time. The board revoked the delegation of authority to the Fair Board in 2008, and the employees of the fairgrounds were subsequently assimilated into the county's personnel administration systems. Removing from the code the references to the delegation of authority to the Fair Board, which has since been revoked, reduces the chance for confusion about which body currently holds those authorities. That concludes the staff report on this matter, and I'll turn the back over to the chair.
Thank you so much for that. I'll now proceed to open the public hearing and accept any testimony either in support or opposition of Order 23-09. First, I'll call for commissioners if anyone has a conflict they wish to declare. Commissioner Farr?
I have none.
Commissioner Seneca?
None.
Commissioner Buck?
None.
Vice Chair Lovell?
None.
And I have none as Chair Trieger. Thank you. I will open the public hearing, and seeing no one in Harris Hall, I'll ask Diana if there's anyone online who wishes to provide testimony.
Thank you, Chair Trieger. At this time, we do not have anyone online for testimony.
Thank you. I will close the public hearing. And the public hearing for Ordinance 23-09 is now closed. Do any commissioners have pending questions on this proposed ordinance? Seeing none, I'll ask staff if they have any additional comments they'd like to offer at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will then look for a motion on the ordinance.
Sure. I'd like to move to adopt ordinance 23-09 in the matter of amending lane code to create consistency with lane manual and current practices as it relates to the Assistant County Administrator classification and the delegation of authority to the Fair Board to adopt a separate personnel administrative system.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
It has been moved by Vice Chair Lovell, seconded by Commissioner Farr to adopt Ordinance 23-09. Any discussion to the motion? Seeing none, this is a roll call vote. So Mr. Mokrajski, if you would, please.
Commissioner Seneca?
Yes.
Commissioner Lovell?
Aye.
Commissioner Buck?
Aye.
Commissioner Farr?
Aye.
And Commissioner Trieger?
Aye. Motion carries 5-0. Ordinance 23-09 in the matter of amending lane code to create consistency with the lane manual and current practices as it relates to the Assistant County Administrator classification and the delegation of authority to the Fair Board to adopt separate personnel administration systems passed. Thank you all.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving right along. Look at us on time again. Off track, back on track. At this time, I'm going to ask a logistics question. We had planned a short recess and then a reconvening in the Board of Commissioners room for our work session, but I understood there were some technical challenges. Diana, do you have an update on that for us?
I do. At this time, we will probably need to just stay in Harris Hall, and we will get staff in to move tables and mics.
To reconfigure. Okay, then I think we'll stick with the plan to take a little recess so we can reconfigure as a round table. I think that'll just facilitate the conversation more than the dynamic at the dais. So is 10 minutes enough time? Do you want to reconvene at 3 p.m.? Do you need 15 minutes?
15 might be better if possible.
Okay, great. Then we will reconvene here at 3 p.m. for our work session. Thank you. of Tuesday, January 23rd, and our nearly final agenda item for today is a work session with our County Council's office to look at Type 2 and 3 land use appeal procedures and potential code amendment options. So I will welcome and turn it over to our Assistant County Counsel, Rebecca Dorman, and also joining us today is Amber Bell, our Planning Director. And is there anyone else from staff online or joining us in a bit?
We're expecting Keir Miller to join virtually just...
Hello, Chair Trieger. Yes, I'm here virtually, if you can hear me.
Good afternoon. Welcome. We can. Thank you for being with us. All right. I will turn it over to staff to lead us through. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Thanks for calling this work session. It's an important topic. I wanted to just check in of if the slideshow is showing. We don't see it on our big screen, but it is showing here on our laptop screen.
I'm checking, one moment. No, it is not showing.
It's not our day for smooth and easy tech.
Bear with us here one moment. My apologies.
If you need me to, Rachel, I can bring it up. Or I'm sorry, Rebecca.
Okay, 1 second here. We'll see if we can drive locally.
While we're in this pause and waiting, I just want to appreciate staff for their quick work to get us set up down here on the floor. Thank you for that.
Apologies.
Here we go. Thank you. I think we just missed one little step, but okay, let's get going here. So my name, for the record, is Rebecca Dorman. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm Assistant County Counsel with the Office of Legal Counsel. Here with me is Amber Bell. Amber, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Thanks. I'm Amber Bell. I'm the Planning Director with Land Management Division. And good afternoon.
So today we are here to talk about a board assignment that was made last year by Vice Chair Lovell. But before we get into it, I wanted just to give you a roadmap for our plan for today in this 90 minutes that we have together. We wanted to break this into parts so that we can have some discussion and question times in between each of the parts. So here on the screen I have the 4 parts. Number 1, just revisit the board direction and give some short responses. Number 2, provide some background on Lane Code Chapter 14, which is where the Type 2, Type 3 appeal procedures are housed. Then talk about what our current procedures require and call for. And then wrap things up with a possible code amendment suggestions, conversation points, and considerations that kind of go into those different possibilities. Thank you. So here is the board direction, which was to set up a board work session with LMD and legal to discuss and review procedures regarding Type 2 and Type 3 land use appeals process and a discussion on potential code amendment should the board wish to change the process. So before I start talking to you about types, I wanted to make sure that we all kind of understand what that means. So when we talk about types, Type 1, Type 2, Type 3, Type 4, in the land use application world, the types indicate the amount of discretion involved in making these decisions, the amount of procedure that's required for the different kinds of decisions, and who the decision maker is. So starting at Type 1, that's kind of the least discretion. It's kind of an objective yes or no criteria. The decision is made by the planning director. An example of a Type 1 application would be an extension on a previously issued permit. So a pretty straightforward application. By contrast, a Type 4 application, for example, an amendment to the county's rural comprehensive plan involves a great deal of discretion. There are application of policies and subjective criteria. Public notice and public hearings are required before the Planning Commission and then also before the board. And any final decision is issued by ordinance, which can be appealed to LUPA. And type 4 applications can sometimes be quasi-judicial. Usually they're legislative, but they can be quasi-judicial if they involve one property. So here we're talking about type 2 and type 3 applications, and those kind of fall between the type 1 and type 4 as far as discretionary decision-making, who the decision maker is, the process that's involved. So here on the slide I have type 2 up, and type 2 decisions are made by the planning director initially. They can be elevated to a type 3 procedure in some cases, and then the decision that the planning director makes can be appealed to a hearings official. And then any party or the director can request reconsideration of the hearings official decision, so that's kind of an appeal. There's an appeal from the planning director, appeal to the hearings official, then the hearings official can reconsider. And then there's also an opportunity for the director to request board review of hearings official decisions in type 2 appeals. So that's high level what the appeal process looks like for type 2 applications. Type 3 applications are decisions made by a hearings official. And again, the hearings official decision there can be a request made for reconsideration of the hearings official decision, and the planning director or the planning director may request reconsideration or board review of type 3 applications. So just to answer the last part of the board direction, we're having a discussion about the type 2, type 3 procedures, and then we're having a discussion on potential code amendments. And so I wanted to give you an idea of what the process would be if we were to get direction to look at code amendments. We have provided some suggestions here, and we'll go through those in one of the later parts of this discussion. But we think that in some cases, a part 2 of this work session may be needed to dive a little bit deeper into what we're looking to do if that's the desire of the board. But any change to the code would be a type 4 procedure, so the highest level of discretion and public comment, public notice, public hearings, and a decision issued by the board via ordinance. Okay, so first pause for questions or discussion, or if Amber wants to add anything to that.
I wonder, could you show the type 1-4 slide again? First slide.
Type 2?
The first slide, the one before this.
No,
that was it. Never mind.
Okay.
That's good.
There you go. I started on type 2.
There wasn't a slide. That's why I didn't get it. Thank you.
Sure. We will show you more about type 1 later. Okay, we're going to move on to part 2 then.
So before we dive in, we'll give an overview of the procedures and the land code amendment process that you all are familiar with. You just had a land code amendment come before you, but we wanted to talk about kind of the procedural steps in the context of this work session. Before we dive into those things, we wanted to just offer, to the extent that it's helpful, some history of the Land Code Chapter 14 Code Modernization Project. The Land Code Chapter 14 was overhauled from 2016 to essentially 2020, and that was the time period between when we began the work sessions with the Planning Commission to the final adoption after 2 remands from the Land Use Board of Appeals, which I'll go over. So it started in 2015, actually, with a kickoff to the Code Modernization Project in a work session before the board. Specific to Chapter 14, that was one of the initial phases of our ongoing Code Modernization Project.
And Chapter 14 is our application review and appeals procedures. The goal of the kind of overarching goal for the code modernization project is to simplify terminology, to streamline processes, to make the code more user-friendly for users that might not be familiar with dealing with the code on a day-to-day basis. That was kind of the overarching goal. I won't read each of these dates, but this is the general time frame of the Lane Code Chapter 14 update. What I will highlight here is that after the Planning Commission work sessions and public hearings and the board work sessions and public hearings and deliberations, the board enacted the ordinance initially, ordinance number 1802, in July of 2018. Then the county received the first remand from Land Use Board of Appeals in January of 2019. And that was centered on two main issues. Those were the code had included a requirement that appeals include a statement from appellants that was worded with sufficient specificity. And I'm paraphrasing, but LUBA basically found that that was in violation of the procedural requirements of state law, because state law allows for an initial, once the planning director decision is issued, it allows for an initial hearings official decision. That's something that comes directly out of state law. There's a first appeal that's allowed, and that's a de novo process. And LUBA said that essentially parties can bring unlimited testimony and new issues in that de novo process. So the county cannot require that appeal issues be stated with sufficient specificity. The other thing that came about was we learned through that first appeal that the county used to have a practice, long-standing practice of allowing unlimited one-year timeline extensions for resource zone dwellings. So those are the EFU zone, the exclusive farm use zone, the non-impacted F1 forest zone, and the impacted F2 forest zone. And LUBA said that the language of Oregon revised statute and Oregon administrative rules prohibited those one-year timeline extensions because the language talks about an extension. So moving forward in time, then in May of 2019, after back up a little bit, we had a work session with the board on appeal trends in January of 2019, and then another work session with the board in April of 2019. And at that time, and I'll talk about that here in a second, there was direction to eliminate the elective board appeal procedure. So that was happening at the same time as when we were addressing the first LUBA remand for Chapter 14. So moving forward with the addressing the Lane Code Chapter 14 remand, that was reviewed in the summer into the fall of 2019, and the board enacted ordinance number 1903 to address the LUBA remand, as well as to eliminate the elect whether or not to hear procedure. They'll talk about it in a minute. And then eventually there was a second LUBA remand after that in April 20th of 2020. That was focused on whether additional one-year timeline extensions were allowed up to a 5-year period for resource zone dwellings. We had interpreted, there was a new state law that came out in the course of this code amendment process in 2019, where we learned that after that first LUBA remand, where LUBA said one-year timeline extensions for resource zone dwellings are not allowed, state law was updated to allow a five years of one-year timeline extensions. So initially, while we were working to interpret that, we thought that because there was some discussion of the timeline extensions at issue in Lane County at the legislature, we thought that maybe there was a question of whether those were allowed to be also renewed. And LUBA essentially said no, it's only extensions issued for currently active dwelling applications.
I'm going to skip ahead here. So just to talk a little bit about the process to eliminate the board appeal procedure. So that's what we refer to as the elective review procedure, or the elect whether or not to hear procedure. And I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit, and I'll go back to that slide in a minute. So this is a flow chart that shows that procedure. The circles in orange highlight that process. So previously an applicant could file for reconsideration or request that the board hear the matter. That was for hearings, official decisions, and that would go to the board for what's called an elect whether or not to hear review. And that there were specific criteria that staff would prepare an agenda cover memo for and bring before the board. Oftentimes, the appeals were not elevated to an on-the-record hearing. That would be the next step. So if the criteria were met for further review, it would be in the regular board meeting set for an on-the-record hearing. If the board found that it didn't warrant further review, oftentimes the board adopted an order to affirm the hearing's official decision and adopt interpretations therein, or remain silent on the interpretations. And then from there, the final county decision, that was the final county decision and could be appealed to LUBA and beyond. So there were, as I mentioned, there were discussions in early 2019, and the board directed staff at that time to draft language to eliminate the elective board review procedure. There were concerns that were noted about timelines, impacts to permit processing, because it takes additional staff time to process board packets and to work through the additional appeals process, and that's can be pulled away from permit processing, as well as financial and other resource impacts. There was quite a bit of discussion regarding the need to retain deference. And so our understanding of the board direction at that time was to work on code that still allowed for the ability for appeals to be elevated in instances where there was a local policy matter, local code matter, where there might be the need to retain deference. And so, as I mentioned, then that was rolled into the Chapter 14 Code of Modernization Project, and that was adopted in 2019, and that's been in place since. So I'll pause there to see if there's any questions or discussion about that section.
It may go without saying that we just walked through the last process of amending Lane Code Chapter 14, and it's not impossible to do, but it can result in 2 appeals to LUBA and a legislative change that pulls the rug out from underneath of us a little bit. So, so that was the kind of the purpose, was to show you what the process was before, but also to give you an example of what a code amendment can entail, time-wise, resource-wise. Move into the next part. So we wanted to give an overview of the procedures that are within Lane Code, and we'll focus on the Type 2 and 3 procedures that are the focus of this work session. Just wanted to highlight that the procedures live in state law and in, as I already mentioned, in Lane Code Chapter 14. And then those are, to some extent, they're interpreted by case law, and that's they can be periodically interpreted by state law, and to some extent, it's kind of a moving target because monitoring case law can change the way the procedures apply, or we have to apply the procedures. So the Type 1 procedure isn't the focus of this, so I just wanted to highlight that that's, as Rebecca mentioned, that's the first procedural type in the tier of procedural types. It's a ministerial review. Those can be issued over the counter.
they don't require public notice. They don't have an appeal process because of that, because of them being a ministerial review. There's a determination that's provided to the applicant. There is a process that they can be elevated to a type 2 procedure by the applicant through an application, or they can be elevated if they will constitute a land use decision. We can issue public notice by notifying the applicant. They can be effective immediately, or they might have conditions of approval, like a type 1 property line adjustment application comes to mind, or a floodplain permit with conditions of approval that comes to mind, just to give a couple of examples. It could also be something like a zoning determination where we're answering questions for an applicant.
Sure. It says can be elevated. What's that? What exactly does that mean? It can be.
Thanks. That's a great question. The code spells out two different ways that it can be elevated. It's either, an applicant might choose that they want to have the benefit of a public notice and an application becoming a final land use decision that can't be challenged later. Or if for some reason we became aware that there is a interpretation in the decision, there's a process for staff to reach out to the applicant and work with them and issue a public notice. So it's through those two ways.
But it would be a staff elevated to type 2 then, it sounds like.
Yeah, correct. It can be either applicant or staff.
Oh, okay. Got it. Thank you.
Okay, and then the type 2 procedure, so that's the special use permit or conditional use permit. It can involve more discretion or exercise of judgment, more complicated criteria. It goes through the quasi-judicial process. The steps include, and this is something that comes out of state law, it's mandated. Initially when we get an application in, it goes into the 30-day completeness review period. Once the application is deemed complete, we have everything we need to make findings to the criteria. Then there's a process in Lane Code Chapter 14 for notice of application that's also referred to as a referral and opportunity to comment. Basically, it's mailing the notice to the neighbors and giving folks an opportunity to comment on the proposal. That's optional for most applications. There's a few that are required by state law, and generally it offers 15 days to comment is the request, so that once staff is working on the decision, we have all the comments in hand. It's issued at the planning director level. There's a 12-day appeal period. There is an alternative to elevate to a type 3 hearing in certain circumstances that's used occasionally. And then there's the opportunity to appeal the matter to the hearings official. I mentioned already that's a de novo hearings process, meaning all the issues are on the table, or any issue that a party would like to raise is on the table. Any party who has an interest can participate. There's a public notice that's sent within a certain radius, depending on the zoning of the property is what dictates that radius. And then the decision is by the hearings official. Again, there's a 12-day appeal period, and there's an opportunity for an applicant to file for reconsideration with the hearings official. Should mention, too, that there is a process as well at the planning director decision level for an applicant to request reconsideration through appeal. We just issued 2 of those approvals to clarify things where there's a condition or a criteria that needs clarification is kind of when that comes up. And then I will talk about type 3. So these are more complex applications. Development impacts might be more significant. There are things like the picture here is a sign for a new cell tower. That's an example. And a zone change is another example. It requires a mailed notice of hearing and also a notice sign. So that's different than the type 2 application. It requires a notice sign. That's a Chapter 14 requirement. Again, the decision's made by the hearings official and after a public hearing,
and there's a 12-day appeal period. And the appeal process essentially then follows the same procedure as the Type 2 appeals, being that there's an opportunity for hearings official reconsideration or to elevate for BCC review. And both of these have to be met within timelines, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, within 120 or 150 days, depending on whether you're in a UGB, the property is in a UGB or outside in a rural area. And then the Type 4 process, I wanted to touch on a little bit more, just kind of echoing the overview of the history of Chapter 14, and as Rebecca mentioned, that can be a fairly extensive process. So just wanted to touch on that quickly. That can be either quasi-judicial or legislative, meaning that that could be either specific to a property, or the Type 4 procedure, can be a legislative, like policy adoption, code adoption process. The property-specific application, that's like your plan amendment and zone change application, for example. And that also entails public outreach. It's a broader outreach. Sometimes we might do more stakeholder outreach initially for certain projects. The requirement is that we issue a notice in the newspaper, a legislative ad. There's hearings before the Planning Commission, and they make a recommendation to the board, and then the board, of course, reviews the matter in a public hearing, and then is ultimately the decider of the policies and or plan amendment applications. And then from there, it can be appealed to LUBA. So to provide an overview of the current appeal procedure that is in Lane Code Chapter 14, after the amendments in 2019 to Lane Code Chapter 14, what the code currently says is that within the 12-day appeal period, the director may request, with mail notice to the parties of record, review to the board of a hearings official decision. And then there's specific circumstances in which the planning director may elevate. So this process was limited to this procedure after 2019, and within the possible look of which decisions could be elevated, it's limited to these specific criteria. And then the options to hear the appeal include if the proposal is to affirm and remain silent on or adopt interpretations, that would be put on the board consent calendar. If it's to adopt the order in order to conduct an on-the-record hearing, that would go to a regular meeting item. And then there's a couple of things that can happen from there. If there's specific requirements that are met, then the board can choose to allow limited additional testimony or hold a de novo hearing. And there's pretty specific requirements in Lane Code that are listed for that, and that carries over from the prior on-the-record hearing procedures prior to 2019. And like the any final county decision, Type 2, Type 3, or on any course of an appeal, a final land use decision, again, must be issued within that state-mandated timeline. So I will pause there. If there's any questions about the procedures, I'm happy to answer them.
We can revisit anything too? Okay.
So I'll give a summary of what the memo provides as potential alternatives. I do want to just note that these alternatives this is certainly not meant to be an exhaustive list of options. We did our best to come up with some alternatives that we could see as possible options, but this is really meant to be a conversation starter. And as Rebecca mentioned, we can see that if the direction of the board is wanting to take is to revisit the
appeal procedure, that we could, if this is the direction that the board would like to take, we'd be happy to return for a second work session to dive into code options or alternatives in more detail. So the options that we've identified in the packet, again, not an exhaustive list, is to direct staff to initiate a code amendment process to refine the current criteria and better define terminology for director requests for board review. The second one is to direct staff to elevate specific issues for board review and provide direction on whether staff should initiate a code amendment to codify specific issues that prompt board review. And we'll talk about each of these. The third one is to direct staff to initiate a code amendment process to allow any party to file an appeal for for board review if timelines can be met. And then the last one is to direct staff to initiate a code amendment process to revert back to the appeal procedures that existed before the 2019 amendments, and essentially revive the full elective board review procedure. So the first one, that is to refine criteria and better define terminology. Bear with me for just 1 second. So currently there's no process for applicant requests for board review. We do understand that there's been a few recent requests made to our office. Looking into that, we found that the current procedure really doesn't allow for applicant requests to be made. Refining the code could broaden the process for applicants or other parties to request board review if this is the direction that the board would like to take. Currently, the planning director may elect to elevate the application, the hearings official decision, but as I mentioned, that's only based off of specific circumstances. Taking another look at the code could provide clarity on how to address a sort of deference issue that we'll talk about kind of what the meaning of deference is here in a minute. We understand that that was one of the board's main concerns in 2019 when we were discussing eliminating the elective board appeal procedure. I do just want to note that there, to some extent, it can be difficult to predict whether or not LUBA will afford a county or local jurisdiction with deference because it's not known until the time that LUBA is reviewing a decision. However, maybe a potential option to look at would be to include something in the code that says, issues issues involving matters concerning Lane Code or Lane County adopted policy as opposed to matters of state law. So that's just one potential option. Again, these are conversation starters that we wanted to provide. So at the direction of the board, we could work on options to broaden or clarify which appeals should be captured for board review. And then we could return with code options that provide more certainty for all parties and work that through the public process. I will note an option could also be that House Bill 3197, that's something that we're working on implementing currently. That is a look at adopting clear and objective standards for rural residential lands as well as what are called non-resource lands. So we have a non-resource zones in Lane County, and so for those lands we will be looking at adopting clear and objective standards. That bill requires work to be completed by July 1 of 2025. So, and it could be a fairly extensive process. We anticipate that we'll be bringing that project before the board for some direct discussion and direction in the spring. It could be fairly extensive. We've been trying to look in, it didn't come with any funding, and so we've been trying to look into potential funding opportunities and have been challenged to find some. So we're trying to identify opportunities where maybe we could find some funding to hire a consultant to help with that work. But there's a potential that we could fold in, if it is the direction of the board, to do some work with Chapter 14, that we could fold it into that project.
Say that bill number again.
House Bill 3197.
What is their definition of a non-resource land?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's essentially, I think of it as outside of urban growth boundaries, sort of all lands are some sort of resource designation. State law prescribes that you have to determine whether it better meets the forest designation or the farm designation. And if it doesn't meet either one of those, then it would be non-resource. If it does meet those, there's other options to go through to designate a land as developed or committed. So that's how we zone things: rural industrial, rural commercial, rural residential. But if it doesn't meet either of the farm and forest tests either altogether, it's not suitable for those zones designations, then there's a process to zone it or designate it rather non-resource.
Kind of thinking of something similar that came past us, wondering if that's to help clarify some of that stuff. Excellent, thank you.
So the rest of the slide touches on the code amendment process, which I won't go over again because we've talked about that a little bit already. But again, it could be an opportunity to better define criteria and clarify procedures. So the other option is to direct staff to elevate specific issues. That might not require a code amendment. We would request direction on whether that's something that the board would like to codify. You know, of course, the downsides of going through a code amendment procedure is the resources involved and the time and the potential for appeals. So we believe that this could be done without a code amendment. It's just kind of a question of there is somewhat of a challenge of tracking issues over time. If there's specific issues that we should bring, should those be codified so that they're memorialized so that they don't get missed if years go by, for example. And as with land use matters generally, any interpretation or code amendment would go through the public process and could be open to challenges. So it's just a consideration there. And then the third, apologize. This slide has some just general considerations. So generally, an additional appeal step can add time and requires, and I touched on this a little bit already, but it can add more resources for Land Management Division. We're primarily an enterprise fund, so past board discussions talked about how the previous fees of $250 and then $950 were sort of didn't have full cost recovery associated with them if the elect not to hear procedure was requested, and it took several weeks. It could take a minimum of 5 weeks to go through the board packet procedure. So that can take away from some permit processing. Another consideration is that we have requirements to meet timelines of 120 or 150 days, depending on if a property is in the UGB or outside of the UGB. And there's risks with not meeting those timelines. There's also, separate from those state mandates, there are requirements at the federal level for telecommunication towers and co-locations and small wireless facilities. And those timelines are generally 150 days and 90 days, and I believe 60 days, if I'm remembering correctly, for small wireless facilities. And then there's some there's different processes that applicants can take to address timeline concerns with those. So I'll move on to the next slide. There's just some general considerations. The risks with not meeting timelines are that if a specific application decision is not issued within 150 days or 120 if it's in UGB, then an applicant can file what's called a writ of mandamus with circuit court. They can be quite costly to take through the process and to resolve. and at that point, the county also loses jurisdiction over interpretation of any county policies or code. Also, the permit fees that are filed, applicants can ask for a 50% refund of the fees for the permits if timelines are exceeded. And then lastly, if there's a sort of pattern that develops, and I understand that there was an enforcement order that maybe came up with LCDC years and years ago, but that it's potential that someone could raise to LCDC that if there's a pattern that builds that timelines aren't met, and then LCDC can issue an enforcement order with the county for not complying with state law. And at this point, I will hand it over to Rebecca.
Thanks, Amber. So as part of the board memo, we added 3 exhibits at the end that were just to kind of dial down into some considerations for any code amendments and this just review of land use applications. And the first one here on the slide is to just talk about the hearings official. This is Exhibit F to the memo, and it discusses the role of the hearings official. Counties are authorized by state law to appoint a hearings official to conduct hearings on applications as designated by the county. The hearings official conducts public hearings and renders a decision on land use cases involving discretionary permits and zone changes that don't require a comprehensive plan amendment. Lane Code makes the hearings official's decision, if not elevated to the board by the planning director or the hearings official in some cases, the final local decision, which is then appealable to LUBA. So it would go from the hearings official to the Land Use Board of Appeals. It's common practice for local governments to use a hearings official to hear discretionary permit applications. There are some benefits to that setup. The benefits include that the hearings official is generally an expert in land use law and an attorney. They're capable of handling the legal nuanced arguments that can be made in these discretionary permit scenarios. It also is beneficial because it shifts the workload from the board to the hearings official. And in Lane County, which is a very high traffic land use application county and appeal county, that is beneficial to the workload of the board. You can focus on policy, legislative matters, and not have to hear so many land use appeals. It also frees up the Planning Commission, because that would be another body that these appeals would go to if we didn't use a hearings official. It frees up the Planning Commission to work on long-range planning, policies, and code amendments, and not get bogged down with the current planning, fast-paced land use appeals. And then another benefit is that, as we all know, land use applications can become political hot potatoes, and pressure is applied to electeds to intervene. Pressure is applied to the planning director as well, and using a hearings official is a way to keep the issues to whether the application meets the criteria that applies to the application, and removes that political pressure from the discretionary process. So that is my summary of that exhibit. That's part of the memo. The next one is to touch on deference. So deference is, there's a one-pager attached to the memo. It's at Exhibit D. And it describes the concept of deference. As Amber noted, when the previous board amended Lane Code Chapter 14, they were concerned about preserving a way to make an interpretation of the county's own code and policies, so that on appeal to LUBA, LUBA would be required to defer to the interpretation made by the board. And so the process that we have in place is intended to be a way for interpretations to make their way to the board to preserve that deference. But it's kind of, we will concede it's kind of a bottleneck in a way. We think that it could be better, but again, it's just a matter of resources and time to make it better and to review it. So deference is important. I'll just leave it there and then let you know that LUBA is required by state law to defer to the local government legislative bodies' interpretations of their own code and their own policies. But if we are merely implementing state law in our codes or in a policy, there's no deference due there. It has to be our own stuff. And the basic background for that is, American government, the judicial branch, has to defer to the legislative branch when the legislative branch has made some kind of interpretation for its action. And the standard isn't necessarily, is it plausible? Was the county's interpretation of their code, was it plausible? Is it not inconsistent with a number of things? Is it not inconsistent? Is the interpretation not inconsistent with what the code actually says or what the policy actually says or with statewide planning goals or with any state law? So it's not necessarily plausible. It has to be a defensible, consistent interpretation. Otherwise, there's no deference due to the local interpretation. And then the last one-pager, which is attached as Exhibit E to the memo, talks about quasi-judicial procedures and the duty that the decision maker owes the applicant and the parties in a quasi-judicial procedure. We've talked about this before, and one of the issues that comes up with our current elect to hear process is the lobbying that occurs when the planning director may issue a determination or say that they are deciding not to take an application or a hearings official decision to the board. Then the applicant or the applicant's representative will be in touch with the board. And if that application should make its way to the board, we have ex parte contact, which has to be disclosed on the record. And the substance needs to be disclosed on the record, and there has to be an opportunity for anyone to challenge whether the decision makers can perform a neutral and unbiased process for that application. So that's just kind of another consideration in this elect to hear scenario that we have. There are lots of other things that would need to be legally researched and vetted and verified as actually good options if we go down this path. So it's just this is just the start of a conversation with you all. And let me see if we have a slide here just to remind you of our recommendation from the memo, and then I think that's all we have for the presentation. Do you want to say what the recommendation is one more time?
Sure. Yeah, so again, that was option one, which is to refine the current code and criteria for elevating appeals. And as Rebecca mentioned, we acknowledge that process could use some improvements, and it's just, a question of resources and time and of course, what the board's direction is.
I'm not sure that I'm prepared to make any of the recommendations on any of the at this point in time. You suggested this could be part one of a series of meetings. I think what you've done now is given us a background that we didn't have before, and I'd really commend you for the work that went into this, making it very understandable to even me, who is not a land use official, that a lot of times the language that you're very comfortable with, the folks who don't do it every day, well, there's no way that you could be as confident with the language as you are. So you've opened up a lot of questions for me, even though I was here in 2017 and 2019. A lot of that was very high-level discussion. So for me, personally, I think I appreciate this presentation, and it allows me to actually begin to form questions, as opposed to direct questions at you right now. Once again, as I said earlier, I'm one of 5.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, this is a work session, so is it okay if I ask Commissioner Farr kind of maybe what that decision came about? Is that something we can talk about here in this arena?
I think so, yeah.
I mean, at that point in time in 2018-19, what was the board's purpose in changing what had been a long-standing appeal process where someone could say, hey, I think I've been illegitimately treated by the hearings official, I want to appeal to the board, and they then said, yeah, we want to move a different direction. What was the intent behind that, I'm curious?
Well, you know, the discussion, while it did come to fruition, the decision was made January 8th in, 2019, right? The discussion didn't happen in January of 2019. The discussion happened to that, prior to that point. And it was in January of 2019, the board changed. 2 new commissioners came in at that point in time. And so it looks like the decision was made by the board that included 2 new commissioners. But really the discussion and all of the preparation occurred prior to that. And for me, what I viewed, and once again talking about me personally, and my recollection was that the process seemed very cumbersome and time-consuming, and what was being proposed eliminated a lot of delays in issuing permits, and that's what I hoped for at the time. I don't know that I got exactly what I'd hoped for at the time. You know, that the reason that I voted in favor that it move forward was to make it ultimately easier for the applicant to move their permitting process forward. I don't know that it did, but that was really the intent of it in my estimation.
I understand. So the problem you were trying to solve for was an efficiency one in the permit processing.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know that that was the ultimate result.
Right. And we've had other conversations about where and how those process improvements could happen that are maybe separate from an appeals process or sometimes in parallel. But that's the right answer to a different question.
And I think it was actually maybe one of the very first decisions made by a new Board of Commissioners in 2019. You know, I think, Commissioner Buck, that was one of your very first meetings that we actually passed that. And I would expect you'd read all of the at that point.
40 pages.
No,
I have a few more questions unless we want to do round 2.
Well, Commissioner Buck responds.
No, I remember a very similar setup, and part of it was not only efficiency for the applicant, but we knew that every time a land use item came to the board, it would always, almost always, I can't even remember a time where it wasn't appealed. So regardless of what we decided at the board level, many of these would just go to LUBA regardless. And that extended timelines for the developers, expense, etc. So I guess at the time I didn't necessarily realize how much money we were bound to save in land management by doing that. It was really directed at the applicant at the time. And knowing that the board itself, none of us are land use attorneys or specialists, even though some of us have developer or real estate background, it's not exactly the same thing. It seemed like an unnecessary step and expense.
Thank you. I think we're also now, just in the last year since, obviously, Commissioner Stanley and I have been here, we've seen a quantum shift in the way people perceive what types of things come to the board. And I guess I'm curious, from 2019, how many appeals have come to the board for the board's weigh-in?
Since 2019. There are 3 appeals scheduled to come before the board next week. Sorry, just to make sure I'm understanding your question. Your question is how many appeals have come before the board? That's correct.
So that's bothersome to me a little bit. I think what we're hearing in the public testimony and the frustrations of people here is they don't feel like they're being heard. They don't feel like due process and their rights have been, vetted fully for in front of the board that could make some policy decisions. There's obviously a couple of cases that I think the board could benefit by hearing. So I guess the question I have going forward is, for us to kind of navigate where we want to go, is how can the board be informed about what's going on a week-to-week process? Maybe a written report we get once a month saying, hey, these are some of the things we're dealing with, some issues, and then how can the board, without making a big long code amendment and all the other things we have to do, can the board say, hey, I really want to hear this because I think there's some discrepancies in this case, or we have some executive session to talk about it, to where the board can choose to hear some cases, not all of them, because I'm not sure we want to get into, doing all this all the time, and certainly I don't want to get into the process of making illegitimate legal decisions where we're always paying extra lawyer fees to defend ourselves. But I think we owe it to the constituents to at least pick and choose what we think is important policy ambiguities for us to weigh in on. And so I think there's got to be a vehicle for that somehow, to where it looks to the constituents and the people that have the issues with land management that we are at least creating a positive step forward to hear further their issues and cases. Make sense?
Yes.
Sure, may I give one additional answer to a nuance of that?
Sure, go ahead, and then I'll...
The board typically, prior to 2019, typically elected not to hear. Very few instances that the board did actually hear. And that's one option always, is elect to not hear. It was requested that the board hear. And I don't recall very many at all between 2013 and 2019 that we did hear. And having 3 next week, that may be as many as we heard between 2013 and 2019 altogether. But I don't know exactly, because my memory's not wonderful.
I would point out, in preparation for this work session, I was looking at some LUBA statistics that they put up on their website, and they explain that when the economy is strong, that's when they see the most land use appeals. And we haven't been in that strong of an economy, and so LUBA's statewide appeal numbers are pretty low right now. So one of the reasons why we may not have seen so many things come to the board is because we've been in the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, and things are heating up again. So this could be an indication of the economy, is another thing to consider.
If I may just respond to Commissioner Lovall's questions and comments. So we are currently providing a quarterly update to the board via email of appeal statistics. I do want to, I am just cautious and sensitive to the fact that when things are before the hearings official and in the appeal period, that's really in that active quasi-judicial process. So for us to report on matters when they're in action and we can elevate them to the board in that 12-day window, and I'll look to Rebecca if she has any thoughts there, but one thing that I'm sensitive to is that it is in that active quasi-judicial process where contact with the board about specific matters, absent a specific process to elevate to the board through code amendment, unfortunately, could be challenged as an ex parte contact. But we'd be happy to provide a report either through in the fashion that we have been, and I think we're in that period of time where we're due to provide a report to the board on appeal statistics this month. And if there's other data or reporting on appeals that the board would like to see for final decisions, we'd be happy to provide that.
Thank you. That's great timing. I see Keir wants to chime in, and it may be, I'm just going to say something and then have Keir pop on and share what he wants to. Thank you for that. I'm starting to learn this thing of the chair as you wait till everybody else speaks, and often what you wanted to say gets covered. So that's good. And often it's by staff in response, so thank you for that. I was going to raise that question of and reminder that we get the reports so we can see what those trends and patterns are, what's in the hopper, what's the result, is something being appealed, has it been concluded? And that was my very question, can we even get a report on something if it's still working its way through? If it's quasi-judicial, and the answer is no, because that is the process. And one of the reasons that's the process and it's so important for us to stay at that higher level and not pick and choose is exactly to have fidelity to the process. If it becomes a sort of we get to pick and choose who we want to invite to come before us and circumvent the process everyone else is going through, that completely blows up the entire point of a fair and equitable process for anyone and everyone who ever might have a land use matter coming before us. So this board, us as Lane County, not just the current 5 that happen to be here today. So thanks for that. Kier, did you want to?
Thank you, Chair Trieger. Kind of similar thing. I raised my hand and then the question had been responded to from Amber. So I was going to respond to Commissioner Lovall's questions. But I did want to point out just a couple of things to address to one of Commissioner Farr's comments, that it is accurate that under the old process, very few of these appeals were actually elevated up to the board level, but that process was very cumbersome in that every single time hearing appeal was decided upon by the HO, staff brought it to the board to ask them if they wanted to consider it, and whether they took it up or not, it just really gummed up the process. And we're certainly open and happy to, as staff has indicated, find different options to bring items to the board that the board thinks are important policy decisions. My goal, as I think the board is aware, has been to really increase the efficiencies and processes in land management, to increase, the effectiveness of the limited resources we have and reduce permit timelines. And this shift in process has really helped with that. That being said, I do appreciate the comments from some of the proponents of this work. Mr. Close and I heard Commissioner Lovall both mention, we could do something that's maybe not the way we used to do it before, is more efficient, maybe a middle ground somewhere, and we could certainly be happy to look at options to do that. I just think reverting to that old process, it didn't serve anybody well, and it really did take up a lot of the board's time, not just staff's time. I mean, there were probably 30 or so board elect to hear sessions each year, plus all the time staff was involved in writing up those packets and the costs and delays that you've already heard about. So I'm happy to hear that even from the proponents of a change in the process, they don't want to go back to the old status quo, and we can find something better that's maybe a middle ground. So thanks.
Thank you, Kier, for that, and for pointing out, part of improving efficiency in permitting, when we say resources, not just add money in to cover this process, but our staff is our resource too. And so anytime you spend on thing A means you're not spending it on thing B. So I would really caution us to not add workload without adding people to fulfill it.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm curious that the cases that you'd mentioned, Rachel, that we're hearing coming up is the first that we've heard in a good many years, but these are not necessarily land use issues. This is big game issues that we're hearing coming up. And I'm wondering, when we talk about maybe changing the system, as Kier had said, which I think is a good idea, I mean, how do we change the system where someone who has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to try to appeal, and in a case that we know of, got it reversed or remanded from LUBA, how do we make it look so that the county's being more fair by not allowing the hearings appeals to the board to be bottlenecked, as we said earlier in the work session, from one person? How do we make it, we have the Senate and the House for, at the White House, we have a check and a balance. How can we as a county create some sort of check and balance where it just doesn't stop at one person's desk, which then, like you said before, could be misinterpreted as a political, or that person's this or that, or whatever the reason would be. At least it in the minds of the constituents has some, like I said, check and balance and some degree of fairness, that there's a chance that the board could hear something. And the other thing that you mentioned too is about us getting notice about things going on. Obviously, there's a time window that we have to play in that if we get a quarterly report, I don't think is adequate enough. And I'm sorry to say that, that might require more staff time, but I think it's important that the board just kind of keeps apprised of what's going on, rather than just hearing, the diatribe of people coming here and groaning about how their lives have greatly challenged and changed because of the difficulties with land management. I mean, those are becoming often and heartfelt. So I want to help those people as well to be treated as fairly as we treat everyone else in the county.
So I'll respond to that first. Thank you for the questions. The quarterly report, of course, if that's of interest to the board to increase the frequency of that or touch on other topics in that reporting, we'd be happy to provide that. Regarding your question about, how does elevating a matter to the board not stop at one person's desk, I think that's, exactly the reason why we're having this discussion today, to explore options, and we're happy to look at, as Keir mentioned, a middle ground. We're happy to draft code options and return to the board with ways to potentially expand or clarify the code to give more flexibility for more matters to come before the board that, expand on that criteria that's already in the code. If it's the direction of the board to bring specific topics up on appeal, then we're happy to receive that direction as well. That wouldn't necessarily require a code amendment, whereas the other options do, as we've discussed. I did want to also just mention, I think you mentioned the Goal 5 Policy 11 example. So that specific matter, looking back through the history and refreshing my memory back a few years, that matter came before the board in 2018, I believe, on board order. Under the old procedure, the elect whether or not to hear procedure, and at that time in the order there were findings adopted that the hearings official decision, which was an approval, had found that the policy 11, the standard that you have to meet the 40 or 80 acre density requirement for forest dwellings, that it didn't apply because it had been incorporated into the zoning. And so that was the same issue that was an issue in the NIMCISH appeal that came a little bit later in 2019. And so at that point, it was a very similar, if not identical, interpretation. And so that would have been likely the reason that was not appealed to the board at that time. Of course, then, and I want to be careful not to discuss the King appeals too much because they're scheduled to come before the board next week. But that at that point, whether to elevate that was complicated by the fact that there was already a LUBA decision on the books that said, county, you have to comply with the Goal 5 Policy 11 requirement. I'm speaking at a very general level, but just wanted to mention that.
So is there something specific that elevated those 3 similar cases to the board, whereas before we hadn't had any in 5-6 years?
The one scheduled to come before the board? Yes, good question. So that we had discussions with the board last year, and I believe it was in May and June, as well as with the Planning Commission. And prior to that, and the date escapes me, I believe, there was another meeting. And so at that time, we talked with the board about elevating the next relevant appeal. And now we have these 3 appeals or applications that are relevant.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
I just kind of have a comment. I think I've heard all I need to hear today in terms of getting a lot of information and helping me to begin to form some more questions. For me, I'd like to suggest we do schedule a subsequent continuation of this discussion. I think I'd also like to say that you've done a superb job of taking what is really complex language and making it understandable to somebody who doesn't read that language every single day. So fantastic. Commendation, applaud, bravo, commendations on doing that. I think I'm at a point right now where I can actually ask intelligent questions. Now that's kind of a broad
statement.
statement.
Glossary of terms on a single page.
Thank you.
But your the slides that you showed on were very easy to understand and very easy to read. Whereas if you try to look in code and find that information, it's impossible to find. So bravo, well done. That's my recommendation, Chair.
Yeah, I think if there aren't other questions, I think everybody's sort of nodding that, a future session, now that we've got this grounding level, shared appreciation for the work you put into bringing us a presentation that helped us get to a point where we felt grounded in the information, so the next session could be useful. And I just want to comment, I appreciate Vice Chair bringing up, the sort of pressure that we feel when people are coming to us very, big investment, and there's few things that people have stronger feelings about than their home and where their family gets to be rooted. And I think that's why those quarterly reports are important, because they give us some context for how many. There's always going to be someone who, there's always going to be, hopefully in this case, outliers for whom the process isn't working. And those reports give us that sense of proportionality. There's always going to be 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, even 5 people for whom the system isn't working, but that doesn't necessarily mean the system isn't working. It's not working for them. And I know our staff does all they can to help give them the information they need to try to adjust and adapt their projects to make it work. But I think we just have to be really careful to stay grounded, stay high level at the same time. Those sound contradictory, but I think you know what I'm saying. When we hear those stories, because they're hard to hear, and we all are caring and compassionate people, but also the framework is what it is, and one size doesn't fit all. But that we just have to be careful not to try to make system-wide changes to fit a very small percentage of folks whenever possible. So without anything else for this panel, thank you so much to County Council's office. I know, Rebecca, you're here at the table, you're presenting, you did the lion's share of this, but I know your office is a team, and I'm sure you had great support, and want to recognize our County Council in the audience here for support and backup, so thank you for that, and thanks, Amber, as always.
Thank you, Amber.
Thank you very much for the time this afternoon and the opportunity to talk about this.
Great. Then we are just about concluded for the day. We are at item 13 on our agenda, Commissioners' Business. Do any commissioners have any announcements to share?
I have kind of a little, just a kind of a feel-good announcement, if I may.
I think we're ready for one of those.
Okay, good. Then let me see how quickly I can find it. I got a letter from a cousin in England, one of my closest cousins. She was my dad's twin brother's daughter, and if I can find it very, very quickly here. Yeah, so my cousin. Yeah, so.
It's a long tree branch.
Yeah, so hold on a second. Here it is. So the letter it was a letter that my dad wrote to the newspaper in Sheffield right after we came to America. And so he wrote a letter, and this is back when I was very, very young. You know, I was in the 7th grade when this happened. And this is directly from the Sheffield Star. I'd never seen this before. It says, a letter is titled "A Letter from America." And it says, a shy Green family who emigrated to Oregon, America, a year ago have had the seal set on their happiness in their new life. For daughter Linda May, who was married in Tillamarsh, Oregon, 5 years ago to an American she met when he was in England on a church mission, has just had her first baby. In a letter to the Star, Mr. and Mrs. William Farr say they miss relatives and friends in Sheffield, but are very happy in the U.S. And 2 Sheffield women, Mrs. E. Brayson of Bellhouse Road and Mrs. M. Clayton of Patmore Road, Firth Park, will be thrilled at the news of the birth of the baby, Robert Matthew Spencer, for it makes them both great-grandmothers. And I tell you what, I cried and cried and cried when I read that this morning. Because I'd never seen that before. And, you know, my dad's mom and my mom's mom were still alive in England at the time. And they never saw him again, you know. But, I mean, this is just a breath of oxygen from long, long ago. You can say it's in a wrinkled, my cousin kept this all these years, you know. And she sent it to us today. So, doesn't that feel good? Does that make you all feel good? Because it made me feel good.
Any other announcements, Commissioner Sanaga?
Yeah, just real quick, did I hear shy in that?
Shia.
Oh, Shia. Phew, that makes sense. I just want to say thanks, and I CC'd Mr. Mokajski on it, but once again to our Public Works for this week. Our Sheriff's Department called on their way to a domestic dispute and couldn't get there. Public Works showed up, cut their way in, and, you know, I mean, just great teamwork. So I'd like to thank everybody that was involved. It was a rough week. There was a lot going on. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah, I think I echo that on behalf of everyone. It has been, last week was really challenging, as we heard this morning testimony all the way down to the individual level in the community, and we're learning a lot, and just appreciate everyone that stepped up. to respond to the emergency of the ice storm. So thank you. Thank you to our administrator for being the glue to keep a great team that you've assembled together through that. So thank you for that. Are there any future board assignment requests? No. Well then, nothing to review. Look at that smile. He's like, yeah, nothing to review. Any other business before we adjourn for the day? All right, then we will adjourn. We will reconvene, hopefully in the board conference room, assuming the technology issues have been addressed by then, for a work session with our human resources team at 9 a.m. tomorrow. So until then, we are adjourned.